this video, I'll be starting on a mock-up of the dress included in this 1920s reproduction pattern set from the Vintage Pattern Lending Library. This pattern is exciting because it has a lot of really cool details, like the contrasting fabric elements, the button decoration details, and the box pleats at the hemline. Making a mock-up of this dress will allow me to test out the pattern and figure out how it works before using fancy fabric for the real thing. This pattern page includes 5 pieces: the dress back, the front panel, the cuffs, the collar, and the dress front. There's also a sleeve piece, which has already been cut out for an earlier project. My first order of business was to separate all of the pattern pieces. I wasn't going for perfection on my cutting here, just working to remove most of the excess paper. I did trim the pieces more closely before pinning them to the fabric. Speaking of fabric, the fabric I'm using for this mock-up is a fitted sheet that I bought cheap from Goodwill. So first I need to remove the elastic. This fabric rips really nicely in a straight line once it's been snipped. Once the elastic was out of the way, I cut into the side seam that makes the fitted sheet into its box shape. That flattened out the fabric and helped me iron everything more easily. However, I managed not to get any of that on camera. Once the fabric was ironed, I folded the right sides together and began pinning down the dress back piece. Unlike the front of the dress, which will be cut into 2 separate pieces, the back of the dress is cut on the fold. The result will be one piece where both halves are symmetrical but mirrored. The long edge of this piece is interesting because it includes the affordance for the box pleat, which is the part that's sticking out on the right side of the screen here. As with cutting the pattern paper, I started by lopping off excess fabric before making more precise cuts. Once I'm using nicer, more expensive fabric, I'll probably skip right to precisely cutting so that my leftover scraps are as large as possible for reuse later. These dress front pieces feature a dart on the shoulder edges. When it comes to darts, it's important not only to note the point of the dart, but also how wide the dart should be. So I'm marking at the intersection of the dart line, also called a dart leg, and the seam allowance line. I'm leaving my tacks extra long so that I can tie the ends together. I have a bad habit of accidentally pulling them out when I try my garments on. This is because I'm not doing them correctly, but for now this is the method that works for me. There are many notches to mark on the dress front pieces. This one marks where the contrasting strip of fabric attaches to the center front of the dress. These 2 mark where the sleeve will join to the bodice. These 3 mark the side seam where the front pieces attach to the back piece. And these mark where the folds of the box pleat will line up. I marked them all with different color threads to help me keep them straight during assembly later, but also because it's fun to use so many colors. The center front strip was cut out in a contrasting fabric. The only notch to mark on this piece is the one that lines up with the other front pieces at the neckline. Time to separate the pattern paper from the fabric. Next, separate the front pieces from each other without accidentally pulling out the tacks. Like that. Luckily, the hole was still visible, so the tack was easily replaced. The next step, join dart at dress front shoulder. First, I folded the fabric right sides together so that the top tacks matched and made sure that the fold angled down to the 3rd tack. I carefully pinned, starting at the tack locations. Then, with the help of a ruler, I marked the dart legs with pencil. One more pin in the middle to keep the fabric steady, and then it's off to the machine. The point of this dart is to shape the front of the dress. In this case, it will narrow the shoulder a bit and hopefully allow the fabric to lay nicely at the bust without puckering. The darts are the only shaping on the bodice of this garment, which will result in the loose silhouette that we expect from the 1920s. So I goofed up a bit on this first dart by sewing nearly an inch past where it should have ended. Luckily, I noticed it before I removed my tailor's tacks. So I went back in later with a seam ripper and redid the bottom. Thankfully, the second dart was more successful.
You're in my heart, Rosette, true love like olive and I. Somewhere, some way, I hope and I pray someday.
Once the darts were sewn, I made sure to press them thoroughly. Ideally, you'd want a nice rounded surface to iron darts on, like a tailor's ham, but I don't have one. Yet. While the instructions didn't mention anything about trimming off the excess fabric, it seemed like a good idea to me at the time. It occurred to me later that this was actually a risky move. If it turns out that the darts aren't quite right for my shape, I won't have any room to let them back out. So I won't be cutting them this way next time. But this is why we make mock-ups. The instructions suggested that I might need to ease the shoulder seam in order for the front and back pieces to match, so I ran a line of loose basting stitches over my newly darted shoulder edges. I made sure this line of stitches was well inside my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on both front pieces. The easing was minimal but necessary. Once I was satisfied that the front matched the back, I pinned the shoulder seam together and brought back the sewing machine. Perhaps you've noticed that my sewing room isn't really a sewing room at all, but a bedroom. I hope someday to live in a place with a dedicated crafting space, but until then, I'm glad my little machine is so portable. I zipped right through these shoulder seams with no trouble at all. Then I promptly removed the easing stitches, which was another potentially risky move, but my confidence was running high. Check back next week for box pleats galore and questionable collar attachment. Thanks for watching.